Bill Barr, the Department of Justice, Russia, the Mueller report, obstruction of justice. Donald Trump may have thought he was past all of it, and maybe you did too. We in the media don't tend to talk about all of that much anymore, but Judge Amy Berman Jackson is making sure we're talking about it tonight. If her name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because Donald Trump and his associates have kept the D.C. U.S. District Judge busy for the last couple of years. She sentenced attorney Alex van der Zwaan to a month in prison for lying to the Mueller investigation about possible collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign. She presided over the cases against former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort and his business partner Rick Gates. She presided over the case against Trump ally Roger Stone. Boy, that was a doozy. And now the Biden administration is appealing Judge Berman Jackson's order directing it to release in full a Justice Department memo on whether Donald Trump obstructed justice during the Russia investigation. Robert Mueller said in his report that he had found 10, count them, 10 instances of possible obstruction. Trump's attorney general said, nah, not so much.
The special counsel found no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities. In other words, there was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion. There was, in fact, no collusion. The evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense.
Remember all that? In a very narrow way, Barr was correct because collusion is not a legal term the Justice Department uses. But that's really the only way he was right. And don't forget, Robert Mueller told him as much after Barr misrepresented Mueller's findings, especially on the obstruction issue. And if that's not enough alleged presidential criminality for you, tonight, some breaking news via the Washington Post. Manhattan's district attorney has convened the grand jury that is expected to decide whether to indict former President Donald Trump. Other executives at his company or the business itself should prosecutors present the panel with criminal charges, reports the Post. Wow. Here to help us understand why this is back in the news, what's going on, is Bob McQuaid, professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School, former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. Bob, thanks so much for coming on the show tonight. A lot going on. What is your reaction to this breaking news tonight from the Post about this grand jury and possible criminal charges against our former president over his finances?
Well, the convening of a grand jury is a significant step in the investigation. We knew for a long time that Cyrus Vance, the Manhattan District Attorney, has been conducting an investigation. He sought the tax records, for example, and he has stated in public court filings that he was looking at a number of different frauds. But convening a grand jury is a significant step. It means we're going to summon citizens to come in and consider the evidence and to look at all of these things. So I think it says that what they have already looked at has borne fruit, and that they believe that they are on track for considering criminal charges. Now, of course, it's ultimately up to the grand jury to decide whether to file charges or not, but it means that it believes that the Manhattan DA's office, at least, believes that they have sufficient factual predication to take this next step.
Bob, do you have a sense of a timeline of when all this could play out? The Post is reporting the grand jury will sit 3 days a week for the next 6 months.
Well, I think 6 months would be the long end of things. It's always possible that you can extend a grand jury or republish the evidence to a different grand jury. But I think one of the things that adds some urgency to this case is that Cy Vance has announced that he'll be resigning at the end of the year, retiring. And so I would imagine he wants to get this case going, get it at least charged, and maybe even see some progress on it. The 3 days a week is a fairly intense pace as well. Oftentimes, grand juries will come in 1 day a week as other things go on in the investigation, like the collection and analysis of documents or the interviewing of witnesses could occur, and then you just see the grand jury come together maybe once a week to look at the key parts of the evidence. 3 days a week is a fairly intense schedule. It says that they are ready to go, that they've got a lot of witnesses lined up to show them. In New York, unlike in the federal system, there's no hearsay permitted, and so the grand jury does need to hear more evidence than would be necessary in a federal case where you could have, for example, one summary witness explain all of the things that they have found in their investigation. And so they do need to bring in the different witnesses. They also would need to lock in any cooperators at the grand jury. So if someone, say, for example, an Alan Weisselberg, was going to come in and testify and cooperate, they would want to lock in his story at the grand jury under oath so that he couldn't wiggle out of what he said later down the road.
Interesting. And of course, there's not a lot of precedent, Barb, for a U.S. president being indicted by a local district attorney. If he is, what happens next?
Well, he's really now just like any other citizen. During the time that he was in office, he tried all kinds of different arguments to resist even producing evidence and was successful, at least in some regards, in being immune from being charged with a crime. But now that he's out, he's like everybody else. And in fact, these crimes focus, this investigation focuses on crimes that may have occurred before he was president, Donald Trump as businessman.
Yes.
So it's really not relevant. He doesn't have the pardon power anymore. If he were to be charged with a crime, he'd have to defend himself in court just like any of the rest of us.
The irony that he might get indicted for crimes he committed before he was president simply because he decided to run for president and draw attention to them. Oh, the irony. But let's talk about the crimes he may have committed in office as president, because the good old Mueller report is back in the news, as is this DOJ memo. What is it? Why does it matter? And why is the Biden administration fighting so hard to keep parts of this memo to Bill Barr, former AG under Trump, concealed?
Well, there's been a lawsuit asking under the Freedom of Information Act to disclose some of these records relating to the Mueller investigation. And last week, as you mentioned, Judge Amy Berman Jackson ruled in favor of disclosure, saying turn over this memo. We learned last night that the Justice Department is going to appeal that decision and continues to protect it. It may be that the Justice Department sees this as an institutional need to protect this idea of deliberative process privilege from disclosure. We wouldn't want, President Trump to ruin this doctrine forever. It's something that the Justice Department relies on. But I think one thing that's really interesting is they did allow disclosure of part of this document, and it talks about the part where the Justice Department was making recommendations to William Barr about whether to say that President Trump had violated obstruction of justice. You may recall that Robert Mueller had said, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to say one way or the other whether he committed the crime of obstruction of justice, because as a sitting president, we can't charge him, nor can he defend himself. It's better to just defer this decision for another day. And so we now know that William Barr drove a truck through that opening and said, well, if he won't decide, I will, and I'm going to decide there's not sufficient evidence here. But we're now at that point, that other day, that future day, when Donald Trump is no longer president, the day that Robert Mueller envisioned, when he was no longer immune from being charged with a crime. And as Robert Mueller said, we are going to collect this evidence now while memories are fresh and before documents become unavailable, so that when President Trump is no longer in office, future prosecutors could consider whether he should be charged with a crime. We've reached that moment, and I am hopeful that they're looking at that question today.
So that's my next question. You talk about future prosecutors. Those prosecutors are in the Biden DOJ. It's, just to be clear, a Biden Department of Justice can go to court and, for whatever legal reasons, justifiable or not, say, we don't want to release this whole memo. That doesn't mean that that same Biden DOJ won't prosecute Donald Trump necessarily over obstruction of justice. It's not either or.
Absolutely. And I think Absolutely. And I think that's an important point. I think sometimes in our soundbite world, we see things as either being pro-Trump or anti-Trump, for one side or another side. And in fact, it's really quite nuanced. There is this doctrine of deliberative process privilege. And although I think many of us, including me, would love to see what's in that memo and the contents of it, I think the Department of Justice sees its institutional duty as defending that precedent, that deliberative process privilege for this administration and future administrations. But they are reading the content of that memo, and they have seen all of the other evidence. And so I would imagine they are making an independent assessment as to whether they believe it would be appropriate to file obstruction of justice charges against Donald Trump. You know where I stand. I have been public on the record that, as you said, there are at least 10 instances of obstruction of justice that were documented by Robert Mueller, and I believe 4 of them make a very strong case for obstruction of justice. In terms of whether they should proceed with that, it's very important to hold wrongdoers accountable when they're at the highest levels of government to deter other people from engaging in that kind of behavior in the future.
Yes, 10 cases in that report. You mentioned the ones you think are definitely prosecutable. Trump White House counsel Don McGahn, who is one of those cases, is set to testify before a House committee next week behind closed doors after many years of waiting. He's expected to answer questions about Russian interference in the 2016 election, allegations of obstruction of justice by President Trump. It's so long ago now, it's easy to forget that Trump tried to pressure McGahn to put out a statement saying there was no obstruction of justice, and McGahn declined, and that became part of the obstruction of justice. But how useful is this exercise 2 years later? Could this be part of a future prosecution, or is this just political stuff in the House?
Yeah, I don't know, because, of course, the Justice Department already has his testimony, and what they've negotiated now in this upcoming appearance is to talk about only the same subjects that he's already testified about before Robert Mueller. So I think the Justice Department probably already has all of the evidence it needs to decide whether to file charges. But again, I think that there's value in having an accounting of this for the value of transparency in government, for the public to know about this. And also, I think it's really important for Congress to follow through on that subpoena. It was served 2 years ago, and he resisted testifying, claiming that he was immune from testimony. Now that we've seen that that argument did not prevail, I think it's good to see that people have to follow up and actually appear when Congress subpoenas them. So I think for institutional reasons for Congress, it's important that he follow through. But in terms of criminal charges, I think the Justice Department already has all that it needs.
You'd think so. You'd think so. But Bob McQuaid, thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us your legal insights. We appreciate it. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.